Chapter 47 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The Council of War in Kioram. The sensation produced by the defeat of the royal fleet, the destruction of 40 of the ships, and the defection of the remaining 60 vessels to the cause of Queen Lyone shook the nation from its centre to circumference. It appeared incredible that one ship could destroy so many well-armed vessels. Our terrorite guns were considered demon powers, and such was the consternation produced by their terrible energy that, were it possible for us to use such weapons in aerial battle, their appearance would alone cause the royal army to surrender. Coltonbury was confident he could soon suppress the insurrection by virtue of his superior force. As for his Majesty, he was beside himself with rage at the loss of his fleet. Had Admiral Jolnar been alive, he would have answered for his defeat with his life. The following royal proclamation testified to the implacable wrath of the king. His Majesty King Bhoolmakar of Atvatabar to his faithful people. Know ye, my people of Atvatabar, that the desperate barbarian who commands the alien ship, the Polar King, has not only alienated the affections of the goddess Lyone, thereby insulting our holy religion and our laws, but has destroyed 40 of our ships of war and induced the remainder of our fleet to follow his fortunes, thereby giving him power to destroy our commerce, blockade our harbours and burn our cities. His success has encouraged many who have hitherto been faithful subjects to flock to his standard, and the terrors of treason and insurrection devastate our beloved country. What will be thought of Lyone, who was lately our beloved and adored goddess, who has treasonably allowed herself to be proclaimed Queen of Atvatabar, and who is the prime cause of all this deluge of crime, treason and apostasy by encouraging a heretical affection for a desperate criminal, and who dares to abuse her holy office by seeking matrimony with a murderer? It would be impossible for this cowardly and desperate assassin to visit our country with such destruction, were it not that she who was our goddess sympathises with his inhuman and infernal work. She has only to speak the word that she has no sympathy with such a monster, and his power will be paralysed in a moment, and peace restored to our unhappy country. Will it be believed that she absolutely refuses to disown such a viper, and even boasts of his work, and that he will shortly set her free? Our prisoner, she has disregarded our clemency in holding back the sword of justice that hangs over her head. Her life is already forfeited by her own actions. The monster of insurrection and apostasy must be struck in its most vital part. Orders have been given for a full conclave of the Barodomy to put our fallen goddess on trial forthwith, and if found guilty to be immediately executed. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Coltonbury, has orders to attack, pursue and put to death without mercy all rebels in arms and arrest all sympathisers with the rebel cause. Given in our palace at Calnogor in the 26th year of our reign, Bhoolmakar, King of Atvatabar. This proclamation revealed the desperate crisis matters had reached. The bloodthirsty king had Lyone in his power, and unless a miracle happened, nothing could save her. The fact that the flag of the Queen floated above Kioram must have added enormously to the wrath of the king, and the supreme question with us then was how to save our Queen from a cruel fate. While discussing this important subject with Governor Laldemir and my own retinue, we were agreeably surprised to learn of the arrival of the High Priest and Priestess, and the Grand Sorcerer and Sorceress from Egyptlosis. Astronomer Starbottle and Flat Hootley had so far evidently succeeded in their mission. Hushnoli reported that all Egyptlosis was up in arms for the cause of the Queen. The priestesses had formed an Amazonian legion of 5,000 Waleals. These would be commanded by the High Priestess Zuli Soas and the Grand Sorceress Theobal in equal divisions. The sacred phalanx of priests of the spiritual palace would be under the command of the Grand Sorcerer, while Hushnoli would hold himself in readiness for a special command. While praising the devotion of the twin souls, a message by telegraph was received from Naphthasia stating that the Lord of Art Yomul was on his way to Kioram. He would travel on the wing by a circuitous route to avoid contact with any of the king's Waleals. Yomul would be accompanied by the chief priests of poetry, painting, sculpture, music, decoration, architecture and dancing. No messenger had been sent to Grasnagalapas, High Priest of the Palace of Inventions in Calnogor, as tidings had been received from that quarter that the priests of invention, owing to their close connection with the seat of government, had become Boccakids of the king. The defection of Grasnagalapas was a severe blow to our cause, as he was the great inventor of the kingdom, and master of 10,000 magnetic Boccakids, the machine being his own invention. Governor Laldemir said the crisis upon which we were to deliberate demanded immediate action, and the first step to be taken was to appoint a commander-in-chief for the army of the Queen. The victory achieved by the commander of the Polar King in fighting the Royal Navy single-handed, and his personal sympathy with Her Majesty, pointed out His Excellency Lexington White, already Lord Admiral of the fleet, as the man of all others fit to assume the supreme command of all operations directed against the Royal Army to secure the liberation of Lyone and the reformation of the religion of Atvatabar. "I therefore," said he, "nominate His Excellency Lexington White, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Queen." The Governor's proposition was received with the wildest enthusiasm, and I gracefully accepted the high honour conferred upon me. Hushnoli was appointed my assistant, under the title of Supreme General of the Army, and the list of generals included the Grand Sorcerer Charka, the Grand Sorceress Thubul, the High Priestess Zuli Soas, the Lord of Art Yamul, Governor Laudemir, Generals Pra and Notothabek. The chief priests of poetry, painting, music, architecture and decoration, and Professors Rackine, Goldrock and Starbottle, Dr. Merryferry and Flat Hootley were also created generals of the army, being at the same time relieved from service in the fleet. Rear Admiral Wallace was promoted to full command of the fleet during my absence therefrom, with the title of Admiral. As President of the Council I spoke as follows. "Supreme General Hushnoli and Generals of the Army of Her Majesty Lyone, Queen of Atvatabar, you are aware of the nature of the crisis that calls us together and the cause to which we devote our lives and fortunes. Our beloved Queen, for whom we fight, is in the hands and at the mercy of a cruel tyrant. We may hear of her death at any moment. Such an event would crush our hopes and blast our cause beyond hope of recovery. We must be both bold and prudent. We must concentrate our forces to withstand the onset of the enemy. A proclamation must be issued making Kioram, which is under the protection of the fleet, the headquarters of the army and the rallying ground for volunteers. Our arsenal in the fortress will begin at once to make revolvers under the superintendence of General Rackine for the use of our Waleals. Armed with these, 100,000 Waleals will be equal to 500,000 men without such weapons. We must strike a mighty blow as soon as possible for the sake of Lyone, our Queen. Once break the power of the King, and he will be glad to sue for peace by liberating our adored idol, the pride of Atvatabar." These sentiments were applauded with impetuous excitement. Hushnoli caused telegraphic dispatches as to the proceedings of the council to be sent to Egyptlosis, Naphthasia, and to sympathisers in Calnogor, calling on volunteers for the army of the Queen to report themselves at Kioram without delay. Admiral Wallace was instructed to send vessels to various points on the coast of Atvatabar to receive volunteers and supplies and transmit them to Kioram with all possible speed. The mines of precious metals of the Queen, situated on the northern coast of the kingdom, and the materials for making guns, gunpowder and terrorite were to be accumulated at Kioram without delay. Professor Rackine agreed, if furnished with men and materials, to turn out sufficient hand mitrailleuses to arm 100,000 Waleals in less than a month. He also proposed to furnish our Waleals with magnetic spears and to arm the legs of the Bokkids with magnetic toes, so that a company of the strange animals could rout a legion of Waleals. We discovered that the materials for the manufacture of terrorite existed in abundance in Atvatabar, and, as the secret of this substance was still ours, we were in a position to work fearful havoc on the enemy. Before the council broke up, the most encouraging news was received from our agents throughout the kingdom that the enrolment of volunteers for our cause was proceeding with great rapidity, and 100,000 men would arrive in Kioram within a week from the date of our proclamation. Hushnoli was appointed General of Volunteers, in addition to his rank as Supreme General of the Army. General Yamul and his colleague would command the contingent from Naphthasia, consisting of 14,000 Waleals. While thus discussing the details of our army organisation, Astronomer Starbottle and his bodyguard Flat Hootley arrived at the fortress, having safely escaped all perils in making a very hazardous journey. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The Report of Astronomer Starbottle. I congratulated our couriers upon their safe return from a successful expedition. The astronomer made the following report of his journey. Following our instructions to bear dispatches to Egyptlosis and Naphthasia, and at the same time make such astronomical and meteorological observations as might be valuable to military operations in Atvatabar, we rose to a considerable height in the air after leaving the Polar King. We were still under the influence of the Earth's revolution, moving with Atvatabar 250 miles an hour from east to west. We found the atmosphere of equal density no matter how high we ascended, showing it to be a continuation of the denser strata of the outer air pressing into the Earth by way of the open poles. It fills the hollow shell of the Earth as an elastic ball, pressing equally on every part of the interior surface. Notwithstanding its mobility, it partakes of the revolution of the earth, hence the particularly serene climate of Bimbisarol and the absence of trade winds in the region of greatest motion, which corresponds to the torrid zone of the outer sphere. The only winds are local disturbances, sometimes excessively violent, caused by the irregularities of the earth's surface and the consequent unequal distribution of heat and cold. Besides the general serenity of the air, there are other reasons why the interior planet is really the only true world where human flight is a complete success. We found that at a height of 50 miles, the gravity caused by centrifugal motion is exactly counterbalanced by the attraction of the central sun overhead. At a height of 60 miles, if the wings remain motionless, we perceptibly ascend with a slowly increasing motion toward the sun, while the centrifugal gravity slowly lessens, owing to the lesser circle of space traversed. The attraction of swang as gradually increases, and nothing but the strength of our wings prevented our falling into the fires of the sun. Our chief discovery was the fact that there exists a belt of air at a distance of between 50 and 60 miles above the earth, extremely cold, in which there is no weight, and all objects therein float, indifferent to the presence of the sun above or the earth beneath. We saw a distant globe hanging in this region of very small size, and through the glass we could see mountains, rivers and seas thereon, but no traces of cities or human life. During our stay in this imponderable region, Flat-Hootley expressed his satisfaction by grotesque evolutions. He would fly, moving his legs as if he were skating on ice, and again plunging as though he were diving into the sea. Then he would fly upward, feet foremost, as though he were falling toward the sun. "Sure, it's fine fun," he said, "to stand upside down, flying and laughing at the same time." "Take care," I said, "and don't fall upward." "How can I fall upward when the ground's beneath me?" he inquired. "The earth below you has no attraction at this height," I said, "but the sun is exerting its influence upon us. If we go any higher up, we'll be drawn into the fires of the sun and roasted alive." "Be jabbers, if that's so, I'll get down and walk, and you can fly around as much as you like," said Flat-Hootley. "If you descend, you'll be arrested and executed as a spy. Remember, we're in an enemy's country," said I. "I'll tell you what I'll do then," said he. "Now that I've got my 7-league boots on, I'll just go down and jump from one mountain top to another." Time would not permit us to stay longer in our altitude. Consequently, we stretched ourselves on the abyss of air and swept downward to Egyptlosis. Our flight was exultant and swift. We soared over mighty ranges of mountains and swept into wide valleys with the ecstasy of birds. What a splendid fact to communicate to the outer world, that man, denied for untold ages the power of flight, may now inhabit a world of incomparable beauty, where it is easier to fly than to walk, and 1,000 times more enjoyable. The powers of the body and the raptures of the soul are not in themselves limited. It is simply a question of environment. No sooner do we inhabit a new environment than both body and soul expand themselves and fill the greater amplitude as easily as the more restricted one. Give the world, weary with ennui, a fresh joy, and see how eager its enjoyment thereof, how voraciously it feasts on the newly found delight. We descended to the level of the mountain peaks, and sure enough, Flat-Hootley, taking his stand on a lofty crag, would flap his wings and sail to the next mountain like an albatross. When alighting on one of the peaks, he frightened an immense bird from its nest on a cliff. It was a seamorg, a bird of prey as large as 6 eagles, with wings measuring 20 feet from tip to tip. It ferociously flew at Flat-Hootley as he tried to escape it, and caught him with its claws, fastening its strong beak on the back of his neck. It was a perilous position for my companion. I flew to his rescue. He was badly frightened and kept shouting, "Kill the beast!" The bird, being on Flat-Hootley's back, rendered him powerless to cope with it. Suddenly the bird let go of his grip of its neck, and took hold of his head in its claws with the idea of carrying him off to its eyrie. Coming behind the monster unseen, I managed by a well-directed blow to transfix him with my magnetic sphere. The seamorg, with its wide distended wings and head falling limp on its breast, slowly revolving, descended to the earth, the first enemy to fall on land at the hands of the invader. Flat-Hootley now avoided the mountains. He had a narrow escape, but excepting an ugly wound in his neck, was otherwise unscathed. We continued our flight to Egyptlosis, dimly visible in the vault before us. We continued to traverse the inner curve of the planet, Atvatabar surrounding us on all sides except that part of the sphere above us which was concealed by the brilliancy of swang. Owing to the uniform heat and density of the lower strata of air, every mountain top was covered with foliage. We saw many mansions of the Atvatabarese sculptured out of the solid rock and surrounded with noble forests of tropical vegetation. We flapped our wings 30 miles above Atvatabar, which lay with its mountains, forests, lakes, cities, temples and dwellings beneath us like a map. We had flown for 6 or 8 hours when a feeling of hunger admonished us to partake of food. The tin trunk, which was our commissariat department, had been towed behind us by means of a rope during the entire journey. "Flat Hootley," said I, "let us call a halt for refreshments." "With all my heart," said he, "but how are we to hold the trunk up?" "Let us rise to a height of 50 miles again," I replied, "and then it will stand on the air alone, like ourselves." "You're a wise man, sir," said he. "It's an inelegant idea that we'll adopt immediately." Accordingly, we were soon once more in the region of no weight, where we stood on the air as on land, Flat Hootley on one side of the trunk and I on the other, to dine on its contents. Flat Hootley, opening the lid, brought forth some cold venison, which he coolly laid on the air beside us, saying, "Stand there now till you're wanted." The venison quietly floated up against the side of the trunk, that being the only force of gravity acting upon it. In a like manner, he tossed around us a cold roast fowl, several varieties of cooked vegetables, and some rich puddings. He also produced several bottles of squang, the Tokay of Atvatabar. These he flung downward, but every bottle, after falling half a mile or so, slowly ascended, and the entire bottles came back to us in a close cluster, as though unwilling to leave us. It was a novel feast. We closed the lid of the trunk and spread a napkin thereon, and at once began our repast. Flat Hootley rapidly secured the floating dishes, and the food was demolished as easily as though we stood on terra firma. I pulled a pudding off my back, and Flat Hootley took from his neck the knives and forks that had clustered there. The wine proved excellent. I mounted the trunk and proposed the health of Her Majesty Lyone, Queen of Atvatabar, and the Empyrean rang with the enthusiasm invoked by the toast. Flat Hootley proposed the health of our noble master, His Excellency Lexington White, the conqueror of the fleet. The air once more echoed its response to our hurrahs. We might have rested and even slept on the impalpable air, but duty forbade us any such luxury. We repacked our trunk and proceeded straight to Egyptlosis, then but 200 miles away. We arrived safe, and handing the High Priest Hushnoli your dispatch, hastened on to the Palace of Art at Naphistasia. We again succeeded in eluding the vigilance of the King's Whaleals, thanks to our speed and disguise, and delivering your dispatch to the Grand Priest of Art, Yermul in Naphistasia, returned forthwith to Kioram. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. Preparation for war. In less than a week, as measured by the time bells of Kioram, the ships began to arrive with troops from various parts of the coast of Atvatabar, bringing volunteers for either branch of the service of Her Majesty. In 10 days, 100,000 volunteers had arrived, and these were quartered in the city, pending their equipment as whaleals and boccakids. As might be expected, a great many were deserters from the royal army, and these were of great assistance in organising the troops, being already skilled in the tactics of aerial warfare. General Rackiron had turned the entire fortress into an arsenal of war. Fires blazed everywhere for forging guns and magnetic spears, and 1,000 hammers were shaping the limbs of boccakids. The department for making ammunition was busiest of all, furnishing the elements on whose efficiency depended success or defeat. A vast quantity of hand mitrailleuses or gigantic revolvers were made, and, being of but little weight, these blew showers of bullets from magazines attached to the tubes. Each whaleal carried 1,000 cartridges. A cell in the case of the whaleals had to furnish a double current, viz. The current that moved the wings and the death-dealing current of the spear. For each boccakid, 2 powerful cells were necessary, one for the rider, and the other to work the boccakid he rode or flew upon. The strongest cell was contained in the body of the mechanical bird, which moved both its wings and legs, and also furnished its claws with a deadly current, so that when a detachment of boccakids dashed into a mass of whaleals, legs foremost, the greatest possible havoc could be made with the least possible risk to the mounted riders. The object of having each cell separate, in the case of the boccakids, was apparent. In case a mounted whaleal got unhorsed, he was able to join the whaleals, or infantry having the same equipment as they. Our superiority in arms when compared with the royal army, which possessed only magnetic spears and shields, was apparent. Of course, the enemy also made the legs and claws of the boccakids magnetic spears in themselves. It seemed remarkable that a people so inventive and who possessed the best of all means for manufacturing firearms should not have thought of a better device than their naval air guns. It was but a further illustration of the fact that the keenest minds are constantly colourblind to the simplest combinations visible to lookers-on while they are pursuing their elaborate researches. But the royal army, if inferior in arms, possessed the superiority of numbers. It outnumbered us 3 to 1. Our total forces consisted of 175,000 Waleals and 42,000 Boccakids, making a total of 217,000 troops, which included 5,000 Amazons. We at first expected a much larger army, believing the priests of invention under Grasnagillipas would certainly espouse the cause of the Queen. But it was a terrible blow to our enthusiasm when we learned that the priests of invention, making a total of 50,000 Waleals, had joined the royal army and would fight against their late goddess. Calnogor being the headquarters of the royal army, it would have been particularly dangerous for the priests of invention to have espoused our cause, surrounded as they were by the enormously more powerful enemy. To our loss, they had chosen to continue as part of the army of the king, which at the lowest computation numbered 500,000 men. The king seemed strangely reluctant to begin the attack, although he knew the extent of our forces in Kioram. It was evident the protection given the city by the fleet allowed us to complete the arming and drilling of our forces without molestation. Supreme General Hushnoli reported that, thanks to the indefatigable energy of General Rackine and his colleagues, General Starbottle, Goldrock and Flathootley, assisted by Generals Charka, Yamul, Pra and Nototherbek, had been able to fully equip the Waleals with mitrailleuses, wings, electric spears and uniforms. The Boccakids, in addition, were mounted on mechanical birds that could either fly, trot or walk with tremendous speed. I instructed Hushnoli to make his appointment of officers without delay, as we might take the field any moment. General Rackine informed us that he was hard at work on a portable terrorite gun for aerial warfare. He hoped to have a battery of these guns ready in time to decide the war in our favour. I thanked the general for his extraordinary exertions and informed him I felt sure of his success. With terrorite guns we would be invincible. Our spies, who had been dispatched in all directions, informed us that the royal army was in a state of activity not inferior to our own. A daily review was being held in the air above Calnogor, and it was discovered that Coltonbury was about to make a descent on our ships, particularly to seize the Polar King, and by thus silencing her guns have Kioram and the army of the Queen at his mercy. The plan was approved of by the King and might be put into operation at any moment. This was most important news, and we decided to take the initiative at once. "We will attack the enemy, even if he is 1,000,000 strong," I said. "Everything calls for an immediate advance," said Hushnoli. We also learned from trusty couriers that Lyone had been brought before the Barodomy, and the Legislative Assembly in full conclave, after hearing the evidence, had found her guilty of treason, impiety and sacrilege to her faith, of treason to the king, and had, by encouraging insurrection, caused her adherents to take up arms against both king and law, thereby endangering the lives and property of the inhabitants of the kingdom. There was no one to recommend Lyone to mercy, and she was condemned to death. The king had already signed her death warrant. She might be executed at any moment. It was a dreadful crisis to contemplate. Our first duty was to save the life of our queen at any sacrifice. I at once called a council of war to consider this all-important question. We had only assembled when a royal courier arrived at the fortress with an important dispatch addressed to His Excellency Lexington White, Commander-in-Chief of the Insurrectionary Army at Kioram. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. I visit Lyone in Calnogor. I hastily opened the dispatch, which read as follows. His Majesty King Aldmeri Bhoolmakar of Atvatabar wishes to inform His Excellency Lexington White, Commander-in-Chief of the Insurrectionary Army, mobilised in Kioram, that Her Holiness Lyone, late Goddess of Atvatabar, has been tried before a full conclave of the Barodomy on the charge of sacrilege, apostasy and insurrection. Her Holiness has been found guilty and is now under sentence of death. His Majesty, of merciful intent, wishes it to be known that he will pardon Her Holiness on this condition, viz., that the insurrectionary army lays down its arms forthwith, and the Waleals separate and depart to their respective abodes, that His Excellency the Commander-in-Chief and his generals surrender themselves to His Majesty as prisoners of war, to be tried and punished as military law dictates, this surrender to include that of the Admiral of the Fleet and the ships under his command. On no other condition whatever will mercy be extended to Her Holiness, and should this offer be temporised with or rejected, nothing can save the late goddess from the sword of justice. Dictated in the palace in Calnogor in the 25th year of His Majesty's reign, Aldmeri Bhoolmakar. The King's communication was received with a sensation of contempt and dismay. The thought of surrender was in itself preposterous, but when we thought that our rebellion would drive a sword into the heart of Lyone, the awful idea struck us dumb with horror. The King possessed our proudest and most precious soul as a hostage, and he was cowardly enough to sacrifice her as his most deadly blow to the insurrection. The crisis was appalling. "Shall we," I cried, "continue the fight, now that we know it is our queen we fight against, that it is our arms that will murder her?" "We certainly do not murder her," said Hushnoli, "and yet this unexpected crisis paralyses me." "The king will not dare to murder the queen," said the Grand Sorcerer, "and if he does—" The sorcerer suddenly checked himself. The mere contemplation of such an event was overpowering, yet he seemed, of all others, the most composed. His eyes shone with a strange fire that I had not hitherto noticed. "I am satisfied," said Governor Laldemir, "that unless we lay down our arms and submit ourselves to his mercy, which means death to everyone here, the fate of the queen is sealed." "I think," said the High Priestess Zulisoas, "that His Excellency the Commander-in-Chief should, if possible, obtain an order from the King permitting him to visit Her Majesty and advise her of the entire facts of the situation, and then act as she commands. If she asks us to lay down our arms and surrender ourselves as the price of her liberty, there is none, I think, who would be so faithless as to refuse." "And I," said the Grand Sorceress, "approve of your proposal. I am willing to surrender myself to save the life of the late goddess." "We are all willing to be sacrificed ourselves if need be," shouted the entire council with generous and chivalrous enthusiasm. "I will go," said I, "and see Lyone as you propose, and upon her decision will depend our future action." A courier was immediately dispatched under a flag of truce to the palace at Calnogor, with the message that before His Majesty's communication could be replied to, the Commander-in-Chief of the army of the late goddess desired to have an interview with Her Majesty to decide upon a final answer thereto, and to request a royal passport, not only admitting him to the presence of Lyone in the fortress at Calnogor, but also permitting his safe return to Kioram. "I fear," said Hushnoli, "the Queen herself may be so confident in the success of her cause that she will overlook any danger to herself. It would be a signal success to save her without our own surrender, but that is impossible until we defeat the royal army." "What say you, Grand Sorcerer?" said I. "Do you think my mission will be successful as regards the life of Lyone?" "I have already foreseen this crisis," said he, "but I believe the end will be triumphant." His Majesty, in reply to my dispatch, sent me a royal passport that admitted me to the fortress to converse with Lyone, and which would protect me until my return to Kioram. "Tell Her Majesty," said the Grand Sorcerer, "not to fear the king, that we will save her, even should she nobly disdain to accept our surrender for her life." "How do you propose to save her life in case she forfeits it?" I eagerly inquired. "I cannot tell you," he replied, "for occult knowledge can only be apprehended by the initiated. Every great reform requires its martyr, and it may be that the Queen will be our martyr no matter what we do." An audible groan escaped from the lips of all. Was it possible that even should we surrender we could not save the life of our adorable leader, and that to surrender would involve all in a common ruin? Was there ever in human history so great a crisis? I began to doubt the sorcerer's knowledge of the future. At the same time, I felt that he alone could guide us in that hour of peril. "Sorcerer," I cried, "for the love of Lyone, for the glory of our cause, tell me what to do. What shall I say to the Queen? How shall I advise her to act for her own safety as well as ours?" "Do not advise at all," said he. "Let the Queen act for herself, and that will be the best solution of the difficulty. But should she insist on sacrificing herself, where would be our triumph?" "The triumph will be assured," said he, "although to win our cause will require the greatest sacrifice to be made." I began to think that Lyone and the sorcerer understood each other, and that her life would in any case be saved from the violence of death, and, taking this hopeful view of the situation, I departed for Calnogor, escorted by Flat-Hootley and the Astronomer. As we swept towards the metropolis of Atvatabar, I wondered if I would be permitted to make the journey in safety. Was the passport of the king but a ruse de guerre to entrap me? I noticed here and there, as we neared the city, detachments of the royal whaleals, some suspended in the air, and others being drilled in globular masses in anticipation of the coming struggle. When within 10 miles of Calnogor, a party of scouts intercepted us, who demanded to see our passports. The leader examined the royal decree with great minuteness, and only allowed us to proceed with apparent reluctance. I had reason to fear treachery, as I had but lately fought my way out of the country. At length, arriving above the royal fortress, we rapidly descended to the courtyard and inquired for the governor. With what feelings of excitement I awaited my interview with Lyone. In what state would I find her, and how would she solve the riddle, a destiny that seemed impossible of solution? The governor, accompanied by his armed staff, approached me, declaring how glad he was to be able to permit an interview with Lyone. His manner was altogether too suspiciously cheerful, and his bodyguards surrounded us closely. I hastened to assure the governor that my visit was made under the protection of the king, and showed him the royal decree. "I have come," I said, "to have an interview with Her Majesty upon the crisis, and that being accomplished, the royal mandate will secure me a free departure to Kioram." "You can certainly see the ex-goddess," said the governor, "but you have no right to address her as Her Majesty, for such a title is high treason to their Majesties the King and Queen of Atvatabar. As to your being free to leave the fortress again, I must confer with His Majesty in that matter, as you are my prisoner until the King commands your release." Was this a plot to capture me? I was too anxious to see Lyone to think of my own safety just then, and requested the governor to lead me at once to her apartments. "Follow me," said the governor, leading the way into the fortress. We passed along corridor after corridor until we arrived at a heavy gate of bronze, which the governor himself unlocked. We thereupon entered a spacious antechamber, severely furnished with large oaken benches on the marble floor. I requested Flat Hootley and the Astronomer remain in the antechamber, while I passed through another door unlocked for me by the governor. I found myself alone in a spacious and finely decorated apartment, the gilded cage of Lyone. There were luxurious couches and receptacles for books and painted tapestries on the walls, and in the centre of the floor stood an aquarium, the home of strange animals and plants, from which rose a vase of gold that held a bouquet of the rarest flowers. The floor was covered with a semi-metallic carpet resembling linoleum. I sat down to await the coming of Lyone. Presently the embroidered tapestry concealing the entrance to another chamber was moved aside, and the pale and breathless figure of Lyone stood before me. She came toward me, robed in a loose white silk gown. Her arms were outstretched, and her face wore an air of indescribable nobility and tenderness. I rushed forward and caught the glorious figure in my arms. It was fitting that our holiest emotions should at first find expression in a mutual deluge of kisses and tears. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The Death of Lyone. When the ecstasy of our meeting had somewhat subsided, I informed Lyone of the dreadful crisis in our affairs. I pointed out that to save her life, the king required her army to disband itself and her leaders to deliver themselves up as rebels and insurrectionists, to receive punishment for their so-called offences. "Now," said I, "notwithstanding the fact that we can defeat the royal army in pitched battle, yet to save your precious life we are willing to surrender ourselves to His Majesty." "And what do you think life would be worth to me?" said Lyone, her eyes flashing fire. "With my dearest friends slain, my cause ruined, and my soul covered with the shame of remorse, defeat, and the disgrace of having purchased my miserable life by the death of the noblest of souls. I will go to the scaffold alone. You will conquer and will avenge my death." "Sweet goddess," I cried, "you will not thus sacrifice yourself. What will victory be worth if you, for whom we fight, are not our proudest trophy? What avails the triumph of our cause if there remains no queen to possess the triumph? Your life is our life, your death our destruction. With you to fight for, any company of leaders will be successful. Let us surrender ourselves to make you free." "It can never be," replied Lyone, "that you must suffer 100 souls for but one. I am that one, and the cause can more easily suffer the loss of one soul than the loss of all. That the soul may again possess freedom is worthy many a martyr. I only regret I have but one life to give for this blessed cause. I counsel you to depart and carry on the war you have so bravely begun, and in your hour of triumph remember Lyone." "There is no cause if there is no Lyone," I pleaded. "Do not be your own enemy. Accept the conditions of freedom so freely offered you, and perhaps even we may still find some means of escape." "The king, I know," said Lyone, "would much prefer your death to mine. He is exasperated at the loss of the fleet, and that too at the hands of strangers. Nothing would give him greater joy, and nothing such fame in the eyes of the nation, than to put yourself and your sailors to death. My capture and your present visit are but the fulfilment of his plot to destroy you. He thinks you will never allow me to be sacrificed, and so hopes for your annihilation. But in this he will be disappointed. In this terrible trial I have eaten my heart out. Without you, without our faithful comrades, life would be less than worthless. This crisis can only be solved by heroic measures. I have decided for you all. Go, go and avenge my death." I saw that Lyone had firmly steeled her soul for the sacrifice, tremendous as it was, and in the presence of such heroism it seemed sacrilege to again offer our less worthy lives for a life such as hers. but a resolve so unsupportable agonised me. I clasped the divine girl in my arms in a transport of love and horror, and implored her again and again to accept life while it was offered her. We stood beside the aquarium in the centre of the apartment, close to the vase of gold filled with flowers. Lyone, in a dazed state, reached for a flower, and in doing so touched the vase, and in a moment fell dead upon the floor. I cannot dwell upon the horror of the scene. I rushed to the door of the apartment and stood in the outer chamber where waited my companions. The governor of the fortress came forward to explain that I was his prisoner until he had heard from the king whether or not I should be permitted to leave the prison. I raised my spear, and with one blow transfixed the dog at my feet. He never spoke again. The taking off of the governor was accomplished with so little disturbance that we passed through the bodyguard, which was assembled in the outer corridor, without interference. The situation was war. Was it really true that our hope was dead, that our jewel, the glory of our cause, was lying cold and lifeless in her prison? I was stunned with the first shock of the scene. I could only cry out as though she were still alive, for her radiant soul to come and share our mutual bliss. But when it clearly dawned upon me that the being for whose freedom I had resolutely laboured had become the victim of her murderers, that I could never again enfold her beauty with my love, however ardent or tender, I was petrified with horror. My immediate comrades to whom I communicated the tidings grew white with the appalling news. The one cry was, "Could Lyone, the idol of her army, the goddess of her people, be indeed dead? Was the voice that could conjure such love and devotion hushed forever?" Leaving a guard to watch over the body of the goddess, I set out for Kioram. Barely escaping arrest at the hands of several whaleals, we arrived safely at the fortress. It was our wings and spears, not the passport of the king, that saved us. The council in Kioram, on hearing of the death of the queen, grew excited. The one desire in all the hearts had been to save Lyone's life, but alas! I dispatched a messenger to the king, charging him with the murder of the queen, and stating that I should exact retribution at his hands for the foul deed. I warned him not to do any injury to the person of Her Majesty, but deliver her dead body to the guard who we would send, who would convey it to Egyptlosis. "This is a wound that infuriates me," said the Grand Sorcerer. "It is the work of the jealous Coronatio and the murderous Bhoolmakar," said I, "and dearly will they answer for it. I must return at once to Calnogor and take charge of the body for honourable sepulture." "I think it better for your Excellency to remain at the head of the army," said the Grand Sorcerer, "and allow me to undertake the removal of the body of the Queen to Egyptlosis. By keeping her death a secret from the army, you will be able to defeat Coltonbury and bring the King and Coronatio to justice. I shall delay the obsequies of the Queen until victory is assured." I agreed to this proposition, being anxious to bring the king to justice, and thereupon relieved General Charker of his command of the 21,000 Boccakids, giving him a guard of 100 whaleals, and requested him to proceed at once to the fortress of Calnogor, and, demanding the body of Lyone, bear it to Egyptlosis for honourable sepulture. The Grand Sorcerer, who had anticipated the refusal of Lyone to accept liberty at the price demanded, but did not apprehend her sudden death, had, during my absence, assisted at completing the organisation of the army. I gave his command of the right wing of the army to Sir John Forbes, Captain Adams accepting a subordinate command. Supreme General Hushnoli had fully armed the various battalions with mitrailleuses and electric spears, and had furnished all with electric wings. I instructed Hushnoli to mobilise the army at once and order an immediate advance on Calnogor. All Kioram was alive with warlike preparations. The various generals and captains, accompanied by their aides-de-camp, flew over the city, calling their troops to arms. Both whaleals and Boccakids, soaring into the air, formed themselves into immense living globes, and in the hollow centre of each flew the commanding general and his subordinate officers. In less than an hour the entire army lay marshalled in the air, and Supreme General Hushnoli called me to review our forces. It was a magnificent sight. High over Kioram stretched a line of enormous spheres composed of the whaleals and Boccakids, arranged in the following order: the army of Her Majesty Queen Lyone, His Excellency Lexington White, Commander-in-Chief. General Sir John Forbes, commanding the right wing of 21,000 Boccakids, as follows: Legion of Art, commanded by General Yumul. Phalanx of Poetry, Vice-General Apornus, 2,000. Phalanx of Music, Vice-General Arndur, 2,000. Phalanx of Painting, Vice-General Remragon, 2,000. The Phalanx of Dancing, Vice-General Osneron, 2,000. The Phalanx of Architecture, Vice-General Vanbliss, 2,000. Phalanx of Drama, Vice-General Clapmavie, 2,000. The Phalanx of Sculpture, Vice-General Hitoki, 2000. The Phalanx of Decoration, Vice General Drapius, 2000. The Kioram Legion, General Notothobok, 5000. Supreme General Hushnoli commanding the centre of the army, composing 175,000 Waliels. The Phalanx of Egyptplosis, General Gerolio, 5000. 1st Amazonian Phalanx, General Zulisoas, 2500. 2nd Amazonian Phalanx, General Thubal, 2500. The Kioram Phalanx, General Pra, 10,000. The 1st Fletcherming Brigade, General Starbottle, 10,000. The 2nd Fletcherming Brigade, General Flathootley, 10,000. The 3rd Fletcherming Brigade, General Goldrock, 10,000. The 1st Volunteer Army, General Jolgos, 25,000. The 2nd Volunteer Army, General Akabol, 25,000. The 3rd Volunteer Army, General Tarabesk, 25,000. The 1st Volunteer Legion, General Swilkar, 10,000. The 2nd Volunteer Legion, General Gararok, 10,000. The 3rd Volunteer Legion, General Botanik, 10,000. The 5th Volunteer Legion, General Heralian, 5,000. The 6th Volunteer Legion, General Nosophrasi, 5,000. General Laudemir commanding the left wing of 21,000 Bokkids as follows. The 1st Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Adams, 5,000. 2nd Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Dorossi, 2,000. 3rd Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Madneef, 2,000. 4th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Dajaltis, 2,000. 5th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Rumix, 2,000. 6th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Heralio, 2,000. 7th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Dunelbis, 2,000. 8th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Napasco, 2,000. 9th Volunteer Legion Bokkids, Vice General Demargo, 2,000. The army in all consisted of 182,000 men and 5,000 Amazons. The Amazons were dressed similar to the priests of Egyptplosis, that is, in pale brown soft leather tights, high boots emblazoned with scales of white metal, heavy spider silk tunics, ornamented with beautiful embroidery and held close to the figure by a belt. The knapsack held the magnetic cell, dynamo and wings, and also furnished the current for their spears. As each Waliel required ample space for the movement of his or her wings, it will be seen that each living globe was of immense size, and the entire army became of enormous proportions as it lay stretched out upon the air. I assumed supreme command as Commander-in-Chief, with Flathootley as special aide-de-camp, and gave orders for each globe to double up its Waliels, so that in each case there would be 2 globes, the outer or fighting force and the interior or reserve force. In the centre of each living shell was placed the commissariat department and the medical, musical and commanding staffs. The Death of Lyone had been kept a secret. The bands of each army began to play the March of Lyone, and at the word of command the vast flying mass of armed men moved grandly forward to Calnogor. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The Battle of Calnogor. Long ere we reached Calnogor, we discovered the royal army already marshalled to meet us. It lay above the city in globes of Waliels and Bokkids, still more prodigious than ours. It was composed of 3 armies ranged one above the other, and each army being equal in numbers to our own, thus forming a solid parallelogram of amazing magnificence. The royal army awaited our onset. Its Bokkids formed in 10 globes of 10,000 in each, and led by Grasnagalapas, the Lord of Invention, were the flower of the army, and occupied a central position where possibly they would do the greatest damage to us. High overhead in a chair of state, supported by 20 Waliels, sat Coltonbury, commander-in-chief of those immense legions that were ready to do battle for the defeat of the cause of their late goddess and the honour of their king. The sight of 2 such armies of winged gladiators sweeping towards each other in revolving globes was one of breathless interest. The approaching fight was a question of life or death to both combatants. Defeat to Almeri Bhoolmakar meant possibly the loss of crown and kingdom, and our defeat meant the annihilation of the party of reform and the cause of Lyone. We were eager to begin the fight without delay. To obtain greater freedom of action, I led the army up into the region where there was no gravity. The movement was followed by a similar movement on the part of the royal armies, who rose like a swarm of locusts to meet us. The noise of so many wings in motion was like that of a roaring storm, and formed an inspiring accompaniment to the music that rang upon the sunlit air. Here, 50 miles above the white clouds beneath, both armies closed upon each other. There was a fearful yell of Bhoolmakar, answered by as loud a shout of Lyone. Our army was literally buried in the centre of the enemy. The impetuous priests of Egyptlosis and the no less eager priestesses performed prodigies of valour. Our mitrailleuses were a complete surprise to the enemy. Thousands of their whaleals were killed ere they could deliver a blow with their spears. There was considerable slaughter on both sides, but the enemy depended largely on their magnetic spears and shields, while we handled our guns with terrible effect. The volunteer army under Hushnoli suffered greatly by the demoralisation caused by the enemy Bokakids under Krasnogalapas. The terrible legs of those machines destroyed the military formation of our whaleals, producing a continuous panic and permitting the enemy's whaleals to work a ghastly slaughter in their broken ranks. In revenge, our Bokakids with the more deadly weapons literally tore their globe to pieces. Notwithstanding our superior arms, the greater numbers of the enemy made them a match for us. The rushing of wings, the explosion of the machine guns, the clashing of spears, the yells of the combatants made a scene of infernal horror. As the focus of the battle swayed hither and thither, it left behind a trail of blood, dead and wounded bodies, broken wings, spears and revolvers. The debris of the battle simply floated out on the air, veritable clouds of disaster. Irregular masses of dead and wounded whaleals and broken Bokakids floated in heaps amid pools of blood. The enemy could only succeed by stabbing, whereas our whaleals were scorpions whose guns were fatal. With the points of their spears they made great havoc in our battalions, but as long as our ammunition lasted, their formations were immediately shrivelled up. Coltonbury began to mass his army in the form of an immense outspreading hemisphere of the form of an open umbrella. His intention was to enclose us on all sides, and so, if possible, devour us. I at once ordered the army to take the form of a cone, each legion being a segment thereof, whose apex was formed of Bokakids, and whose base was wide circles of whaleals. With the blast of the trumpet, I drove the entire army like an enormous javelin right through the heart of the foe, tearing a yawning chasm, 1/2 mile in diameter in his ranks. We lost fully 2,000 men in this moment, and the foe over 10,000 in killed and wounded. The enemy, paralysed by the onset, became consolidated into 3 or 4 immense globes. In front of these they placed their Bokakids, whose monstrous limbs alone could keep our spears at a safe distance. It was the intention of Coltonbury to ram us with the cohorts led by Krasnogalapas and his Bokakids. Hastily reforming our broken ranks as before, I ordered a flank movement, rapid and decisive. Our Bokakids plunged into a tremendous mass of whaleals. In the chasm thus made in the ranks of the enemy, General Zuli Soas threw her Amazons, protected on either side by the legions of priests of Egyptlosis under Gerolio. The priestesses, whose spears were particularly long and powerful, did terrible execution. The enemy was for a time panic-stricken as the glorious girls made their successful onset. The dramatic beauty and the flash of their spears made a scene of imposing grandeur. Coltonbury, recovering from his surprise, ordered his Bokakids to the centre of the fight. To prevent the sacrifice of the priestesses by overwhelming odds, I sent the Bokakids of Art to their assistance. These swept to the rescue like a flight of eagles, and the Empyrean echoed to the roar of the combat. The fighting now became general. The sunlit heavens seemed filled with the ferocity of war. The discharge of guns, the yells of whaleals, the trumpet signals of the commanders, the crash of swords and spears, the ceaseless motion of wings, and the long trail of dead and wounded combatants that followed the fight like the debris of a comet was a sight but rarely beheld by human eyes. Each army seemed so equally balanced. The king's army had the advantage in numbers and our own the advantage in weapons that neither party could yet claim a victory. Further fighting seemed useless until some new tactics were employed. Therefore I gave orders for a cessation of the battle and caused flags of truce to be hoisted. Both armies indeed required food and repose, and the wounded required immediate attention. The enemy was no less anxious for a truce than ourselves. Consequently all fighting ceased and both armies withdrew. Several miles apart, sentinels were placed on guard on outposts in the atmosphere, and our whaleals threw themselves upon the air in various attitudes of repose. In company with Generals Hushnoli, Laldemir, Gerolio, Zuli Soas, Thubal, Charka, Yamul, Starbottle and Goldrock, I visited the scene of the battle. How ghastly the realities of war! There floated irregular piles of dead and wounded bodies, from which poured many a trickling stream of ruddy life, which formed immense cloud pools of blood surrounding each ghastly pile. The heaped-up masses of the dead would vibrate as some poor suffocating wretch struggled in his last agonies. Dr. Merryferry and his assistants hastily took possession of the wounded and ministered to their necessities. Water was supplied them from leathern bags of water that formed part of the commissariat supplies. I ordered a detachment of whaleals to separate the living from the dead and bear the wounded to Kioram for immediate attention. The saddest sight of all was a cluster of 50 beautiful priestesses embracing one another in a long caress of death. They had been slain with the magnetic spears, so happily there were no gaping wounds from which lifeblood flowed. Ardsolus and Murga lay dead where the fight was hottest, both slain at once. The dead and wounded twin souls were sent to Egyptlosis as quickly as possible, and the process of clearing the air of the havoc of war was carried out by both the enemy and ourselves with the greatest dispatch. The losses of the enemy were 4 times greater than ours, owing to the tremendous execution done by our gigantic pistols. The royal troops presented in ghastly groups every possible posture of the human body that could be created by rage, pain, fear, or madness. How I wished some eloquent historian could have floated through that abyss of horror on distended wings and, pen in hand, describe its dramatic desolation and terror. Clouds of vultures and seamorg were devouring the dead bodies, and, as they fought for choice morsels, flapped their wings in pools of gore. Many of the combatants, including some of my own sailors, were drowned in globes of blood. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. Victory. The whaleals rested and slept outstretched upon the air close to the scene of battle. Not having any weight as regarded external objects, they mutually attracted each other, and to obtain freedom and rest without being crushed together into suffocating masses of men, they were formed into companies of 100 each, with their feet pressing against solid cylinders of spears. Mutual gravity was sufficient to hold them together, and each whaleal spread himself upon the air as upon a bed of down, enjoying luxurious repose. I had slept, I know not how long, in company with the leaders of our army, when I was awakened by Flat Hootley, who informed me that a trusty messenger from Grasnagillipas, Lord of Invention and General of the King's Bockakids, desired to see me as a bearer of an important dispatch from his master. The messenger, saluting, handed me the following document. To His Excellency Lexington White, Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Queen Leone, from Grasnagillipas, General of the Royal Bockakids, greeting. General Grasnagillipas begs to report that he and his Bockakids have ever been in sympathy with the late goddess, but were prevented from espousing her cause by the overwhelming presence of the royal army in Calnogor. To show his detestation of the horrible act of criminal cowardice on the part of His Majesty, he offers his sword and command of his Bockakids to the cause of the late adorable goddess and Queen of Atvatabar, and, on the acceptance of such assistance by your Excellency, will at once leave the ranks of the royal army and enter that of her late Majesty to fight for the sacred cause and assist in punishing a perfidious king. Grasnagillipas. The loss attending the withdrawal of the priests and priestesses to form a guard of honour to the illustrious dead was more than compensated for by the reinforcements under Grasnagillipas, to whom I sent a message of gracious acceptance of his services. The army, being fully aroused for conflict, had the satisfaction of welcoming reinforcements from 2 opposing directions, viz. the 50,000 Bockakids under Grasnagillipas and the Terrorite battery under the command of General Rackiron. As was expected, the departure of the bravest general in the royal army was the signal for a renewal of hostilities, and Coltonbury, mad at the serious defection of his troops, at once assumed the offensive. He had received a large recruitment of whaleals and felt as formidable as ever. His army swept down upon us with warlike music rolling like thunder, and cries of Bhoolmakar. The king himself, having dealt us his most terrible blow, was a witness to the onset of his hosts. He sat aloft in a golden palanquin, borne on the shoulders of his followers, with a bodyguard on either side. The advance guard of the enemy consisted of several regiments, armed with our own hand mitrailleuses taken from prisoners. These did a terrible execution among our whaleals. Grasnagillipas, anxious to undo the injury he inflicted on us during the first battle, and emulous of the prowess of our own 40,000 Bockakids, plunged headlong amid the foe, creating a panic wherever his gigantic birds descended. He fought like a demon, neither asking nor giving quarter. General Rackiron, having got his Terrorite battery into position, was eager to check the advance of the enemy by saluting him with a few aerial torpedoes. There was some delay incidental to the first actual operations of a hastily constructed battery, but the daring ingenuity of the professor overcame every obstacle. Each gun, supported by 50 men, possessed a solid foundation from which to direct its operations. The enemy, though harassed by our Bockakids, had worked into the centre of our army by sheer weight of numbers. Our Whaleals, having exhausted their ammunition, had to fall back on their electric spears, and at times were obliged to retire in confusion. At this juncture, a shell of terrorite exploded among the foe with thrilling effect, destroying at least 200 Bockakids. Coltonbury, who evidently attributed the disaster to an explosion of gunpowder in his own ranks, closed up the broken columns and renewed the attack. 3 explosions in rapid succession, right in the centre of the enemy, caused the greatest consternation, and produced a frightful gap, where but a moment before the air was thick with an armed host. Generals Yermul, Garolio, Laldemir and Grasnagilipas plunged with their Bockakids into the living cavern produced by the torpedoes, and with their spears mowed down thousands of the panic-stricken Whaleals. Another terrorite shell, thrown in the direction of the king, destroyed a few hundred of his protectors and induced his majesty to seek safety in immediate flight. Not wishing to lose so important an enemy, I ordered General Flathootley and the 2nd Legion of Fletchermings to start in hot pursuit of the royal party and bring me back the king, dead or alive. Flathootley, delighted with the mission, started off at once in pursuit of Bhoolmakar. The terrorite battery proved our most effective weapon in castigating the enemy. I could not thank Professor Rackine sufficiently for his great genius and mechanical skill in so rapidly perfecting his weapons, which were modelled on the plan of the guns belonging to the Polar King. Every discharge proved a blast of destruction to the foe. The deadly missiles wrought a fearful slaughter, steadily decimating the ranks of the royal army, which had no similar weapons with which to retaliate upon us. The frightened hosts, constantly changing their focus, left behind them vast heaps of the dead and wounded and globes of floating blood. On one occasion, the 1st Brigade of Fletchermings, led by General Starbottle, in eagerly pursuing the enemy, dashed through a pool of blood 3 feet in thickness, and every Whaleal emerged dripping with gore. Coltonbury, finding further resistance useless, at once surrendered himself and his army to our mercy. My brave Whaleals, flushed with victory, saluted me with cries of "Long live Lexington White, King of Atvatabar!" But what was success now without the one priceless soul to share my triumph? Did ever glory so grand and defeat so terrible so mingle themselves in human experience? My Whaleals, now for the first time hearing of the death of their queen, would have torn Coltonbury to pieces had I not protected him. I knew he was personally innocent, and my Whaleals were already in pursuit of the king. We entered Calnogor in triumph. I heard on all sides a wail of lamentation for Lyone, mixed with applause for the conqueror. It was a scene in which conquest and misery, rapture and failure, life and death were indubitably united. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. Reincarnation. The Grand Sorcerer Charka and his guard had with reverend flight borne the body of their goddess Lyone to the Palace of Souls, mourning the death of their adored, who had been so precious, so beautiful, so holy. The High Priestess and the Grand Sorceress, together with the priests and priestesses of Egyptlosis, on hearing of the death of Lyone, departed at once for Egyptlosis to mourn the death of their goddess. Lyone was dead. Ah me, what triumph then, without my soul of souls to share its delights! The blessed cup of joy, quivering to the brim, was about to touch my yearning lips, when it was dashed aside by a treacherous hand. Well might the crownless Bhoolmakar laugh in whatever damnable retreat he had retired to. His revenge was complete. Oh, the pity of it! The young, the adorable, the divine soul who was just about to remount her throne to receive a purer adoration from her people. She who was to be Queen of Atvatabar, slain treacherously within sight of the Bormidofia, where she had so long been worshipped. It was impossible for me to remain longer on the field of battle. I wanted to fling myself on that once happy form and kiss her death-cold lips. I left Coltonbury and his surrendered army in the hands of the Supreme General Hushnoli and started at once for Egyptlosis. As my wings devoured the leagues of air, I thought, was this the climax for which I fought? I flew along with none to share my torture. My heart was rent wide open, and in my agony I rolled upon the air as I flew, for brain and soul seemed an ocean of fire. I arrived at Egyptlosis full of anguish. With quivering lips and burning tears I staggered into the portal that led to the subterranean palace where I knew my loved one was laid. I silently entered the magnificent abode of the sorcerer, horror-stricken with despair. Suddenly, beyond the labyrinth, I heard a golden sound, the sound of that blessed bell that once before rolled its waves of delight over my spirit. I stood leaning against a pillar, dissolved in its bewitching moans, luxuriating in the agapimony of music breathed from the delirious bronze. I heard, wafted from the mysterious temple, the refrain of thousands of voices chanting a ritual of love and peace. The multitudinous sound seemed so soft and so thrilling, so powerful and so holy, that I was eager to know if such a burden of love was the sorrowing passion of the twin souls in honour of their dead goddess. I saw through the open doors of the temple a moving throng of twin souls, swaying in masses hither and thither, with naked feet on the aquilium floor. On every forehead burned an electric star, giving a spectral flush to the scene. That was the singular multitude I had heard, the hierophants of the Holy Soul. As my eyes grew accustomed to the objects before me, I saw the interior of the temple, on whose sculptured walls and roof roses wove of smouldering electric fire revealed their burning bloom. Wires of platinum, terrellium and aquilium had been woven into a filigree of roses, with leaves and stems made red-hot by the electric current. High above the sculptured dado rose strange windows of illuminated glass, in colours sad and brilliant, made visible by thousands of electric lights hidden in the sculptured recesses behind each window. The subject of each jewelled pane was a tableau of Reincarnation, in which the figures of sorcerers and magicians robed in splendid attire gave life to beings that had died. The frieze was one continual blaze of colour, formed also of enamelled glass emblazoned with life-size processional figures and illuminated with incandescent lights. In a distant part of the temple, on a terrellium pedestal, I saw again a monster of gold with a terrible head and outstretched wings. As I surveyed this stupendous figure, I discovered that it held in its forepaws an immense helix of terrellium wire, 10 feet in length and 9 feet in diameter. One end of the wire was joined to 10,000 wires, whose extremities, terminating in the terrellium wands, were held by the twin souls. Each priest held a wand in his right hand, and each priestess a wand in her left, and their disengaged arms were wound around one another's waists. The other end of the voluminous wire forming the helix terminated in the rivet of an enormous spring that held a circular rotome close to the circular mouth of the helix. On a pedestal level with the upheld battery, reached by a spiral stairway, stood the grand sorcerer Chaka, robed in tissues of white silk and golden embroidery. An assistant priest turned a wheel that moved a screw pointing toward the spring of the rotome. The moment the screw touched the spring, the circular plate over the heart of the helix began to vibrate audibly. Another turn of the screw, and a vital thrill filled the temple with its sonorous music. I then knew that all that mysterious structure with its terrellium wires was an immense spiritual battery, charged with the life and love of 10,000 souls. The vital fluid, generated in the yearnings of ideal love, flooded the helix with its vitality. It induced a magnetism of life that made the rotome vibrate with emotion until the whole temple shook with the thrilling sound. The priests and priestesses sang their ritornels of passion and love, and the grand sorcerer waved his wand over the monster's head. It was then the thought of Lyone filled my soul with a terrible yearning. Where was her hapless body? Was this feast of passion that I beheld her obsequies, or could it be some occult incantation to raise her from the dead? The thought fired my brain with madness. Oh, that it might be possible for her to live again, if only for 1 hour, that she might hear of victory. All at once I seemed to know that Lyone was laid in the heart of the helix, held by the helioherent. I knew that the spectacle I beheld was the ceremony of reincarnation. I knew that the goddess was being swathed with currents of life from her votaries. How I blessed those living batteries, so faithful in their glorious work. How I blessed the adorable sorcerer who conducted this precious ministry of life, who focused the love of thrilling souls upon the person of their goddess. I stood transfixed to the floor, watching with straining eyes those flames of life perform their ritual of reincarnation. The air of the temple grew warm as blood and infinitely holy. Soft and piercing music rose from unseen chambers of the temple, which, mingling with the blessed storm of life that beat upon the mouth of the helix, seemed to whirl away my senses. The first circle of souls around the dragon comprised the votaries of Bishano or sorcery, Haliano or magic, Nidalano or astrology, Padano or soothsaying. The second circle embraced the adepts of Niano or witchcraft, Redahano or wizardry, Bicano or the oracle, Kielano or augury, Tokdarano or prophecy, Jikarano or geomancy, Jokdilano or necromancy. The third circle embraced the hierophants of Orfitano or conjuration, Oriolano or divination, Pridano or clairvoyance, Ecthiano or mesmerism, Sidishano or electrobiology, Odolfano or theosophy, Bishanamano or spiritualism. How shall I describe the spell of that hour? Glimmering figures clad in robes of finest gossamer of the rarest colours, powderings and embroiderings, sang the songs of pained and enraptured sensibility. They loved, they wept, they supplicated Harikar. I saw twin souls embrace in infinite tenderness, and again with ecstatic enthusiasm. It was a sea of supernatural emotion. It was an abyss of affection, filled with a whirlwind of bold, delicate, enormous love. A religieuse of Tokdarano shouted, "She will live again!" A priest of Bicano sang, "She will be born again of mystical, chivalrous love." As the enraptured host sang of life and love, I felt a million exaggerations of the delicacies of emotion. I felt as though fanned with warm winds blowing over wildernesses of flowers. I heard the multiplied splendour of bells, roaring like the soft vociferations of far-off tropic seas. I heard music ineffably tender and sublime, wailing its intoxicating melodies. I saw strange illuminations dissolve in never-ceasing explosions of colour on the glorified windows. I saw upon the floor endless arabesques of twin souls, fantastically entangled and unrolled. Suddenly the temple shook with an explosion of sound that seemed the concentrated madness of drums and organs and bells. The roaring of the rotome grew deafeningly louder, mingling with a strange shivering sound, such as is produced by the suddenly transfixed wheels of a flying locomotive, tearing the metals into a hissing blaze. From the mouth of the Heherent streamed a blaze of fire. I looked where the sorcerer stood. Heavens and earth! He was holding Lyone in his arms, alive from the living battery. Lyone, the peerless soul of souls, alive once more and triumphant over death. The temple whirled around me, rapid as fire, and I fell to the ground, insensible with joy. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. Lexington and Lyone hailed King and Queen of Atvatabar. The extraordinary scenes attending the reincarnation of Lyone had left me when I returned to my senses, exhausted with emotion. It was gloriously true that she who was the supreme goddess, she who had suffered death in the fortress of Calnogor, had been restored to life by the powerful necromancy of the sorcerer and his college of twin souls. I rushed forward in presence of the entire congregation and embraced in turn the radiant Lyone and the beloved Charka. I took her living figure in my arms. She was in a limp, tranquil condition, yet happily alive. The happy priests and priestesses shouted with enthusiasm, "Long live Lexington and Lyone, King and Queen of Atvatabar!" It was a blissful moment to us both. The future that had lain under the terrors of death now smiled again. I gazed upon my beloved's face with unspeakable tenderness. I saw that she smiled at me sweetly. Her apostasy was victorious, but who could have supposed that the martyrdom and reincarnation were the path to glory? She had exchanged the crown of the goddess for that of queen. Handing my precious burden back to Charka again, I addressed the congregation as follows. Priests and priestesses of Egyptlosis, Waliels and Amazons of the sacred and victorious army, I thank you from the depths of my heart for your loyal salutation, but I particularly thank the Grand Sorcerer Charka and you, his hierophants, for your glorious restoration of Her Majesty to life, king and crown, thus defeating the cowardly crime of the ex-king. By reason of our victory, their Majesties King Bhoolmakar and Queen Toplessy of Atvatabar are deposed from the throne, and his ex-Majesty, by reason of his great crime, is condemned to death. The causes that led to this revolution are already known to you. The time was ripe for a reform in Egyptoplosis. Regulation and not suppression will be our aim, and they who have helped us to this great conquest will not go unrewarded. After her tremendous experiences, the Queen will require a session of absolute rest to restore her to perfect health. I will entrust the task of establishing a reform of Egyptoplosis in competent hands, assisted by a council of your own representatives. The present crisis is too overwhelmingly happy to permit me to say more to you. On another occasion, I will thank you more effectively. The speech was received with enthusiastic applause. On a litter, supported by 6 twin souls, Lyone was tenderly brought out of the temple. We departed amid joyful paeans of music, our pathway being strewn with flowers. We reached the supernal palace, and saw from every roof floating the flag of Lyone in token of our victory. In her palace, on a couch of pale green velvet, lay the reincarnated form of Lyone, filled with a sense of luxurious rest. The experiences of the past few days demanded a period of profound repose. Her face wore a blessed and triumphant smile. She had paid with suffering for that nirvana of joy. With reincarnation, or rather resurrection, had come a holier transfiguration of form and face. She was still too weak physically to discuss at length the great changes that had come to her, or to the history of Atvatabar. She was the symbol of the more sensitive souls of humanity, who, capable of intense suffering and delirious rapture, must needs purchase all their joys with heart-rending experiences. The culture that comes from agony is our most priceless possession, and brings the soul to every feast as well as the body. The body, daily slain by suffering, is resurrected with a purer flesh, and receives a reincarnated soul fitted for ideal delights. It has attained a measure of nirvana. It anticipates immortality by reason of suffering and love. Lyone had more than all achieved an ideal existence. Before she would again be able to return to the realities of the world, it was necessary that time should be given to her for physical and spiritual invigoration. "I feel neither pain nor fatigue," said Lyone. "My senses seem drowned in a delicious rest. You tell me that I have been dead and brought to life again, and although I have no sense of having passed through the agony, I must believe you. I remember touching a golden vase of flowers in my prison, and then all became blank until I stood with the Grand Sorcerer in the Temple of Reincarnation." "That vase you touched," said I, "was connected with a powerful magnetic battery which was placed in your apartment by the King's order to kill you. Grasnagalapas, leader of the King's Bokkids, on learning of his royal master's treachery, immediately transferred his allegiance and important command to our army, and was mainly instrumental in securing the victory." "So our cause has triumphed," said Lyone. "And what has become of the king?" "The king," I replied, "is king no more. I am king of Atvatabar, and you are my beloved queen." Lyone turned aside her face and wept tears of joy. "Our marriage," I added, "will inaugurate the reign of a religion of wedded love, and you will sit with me as queen on the throne of Atvatabar." "That will be glorious," said Lyone, "but I fear our marriage will also end ideal love and sorcery, and the nirvana of 100 years, the fairest products of Egyptoplosis." "Do you see now," I said, "that ideal joys in the world can only be built on more extensive miseries? It would be a glorious thing to build houses of jewels, but so long as real jewels are so rare, we must be content with rocks. Still there are jewels, and in Atvatabar I learn they are much more abundant than on the outer planet. Therefore it might be proper for twin souls to walk on love's enchanted ground for a brief though definite period." Lyone had undergone transfiguration. Beautiful as a spirit, her figure seemed plastic porcelain. Death had made more luminous the splendid sculpture of her face. As she spoke, it seemed to me that we had closed the door on the infelicitous experiences of actual life, and were opening the gates of a more glorious day. I informed Lyone of the arrival of the 2 vessels from the outer world, and of the great services of Captain Adams and Sir John Forbes in turning the tide of battle by sea in our favour. She was delighted at the prospect of meeting fresh visitors from the outer world, and in due time Captain Adams and Sir John Forbes and their entire ship's company stood before her, who was delighted with the fuller acquaintance thus made with the people of the outer world. Both the captains and their officers realised her ideal of exotic manhood, which combined stalwart proportions with intellectual benignity of face. Sir John Forbes was very complimentary in his praise of the grace and beauty of Lyone and her associates among the priestesses of Egyptlosis. He considered Lyone to possess spiritual beauty to an extraordinary degree. The wonderful pale gold of her complexion was in marked contrast to the old gold complexion of the women of Atvatabar. He also praised the splendid beauty of Zuli Soas and Thobal, who were indeed magnificent women. My success encouraged the strangers to consider that conquest in the other realms of Plutasia would be an easy accomplishment, especially if armed with such weapons as those possessed by the sailors of the Polar King. But even admitting superiority of weapons, they thought it a marvellous thing that one small vessel with but 80 men could conquer 50 millions of people. In my own mind, I thought it possible that the Polar King might conquer still greater kingdoms, and that in time I might be Plutarch of Plutasia. But in such business, one realm at a time is enough. I suggested to our visitors that there were at least 20 realms, each as large as Atvatabar, in this interior planet, that would give them opportunity for adventure. "We also wish," said I, "both the United States and England to know that our ports are open for commerce and foreign trade is welcome to seek our shores. We have gold enough to enrich all comers from the outer world." The eyes of our visitors and their officers glistened at this intelligence, and well they might, for Atvatabar was worth 1,000 realms like Golconda or Peru. We had wealth for literature and science, art and commerce, which rightly used would make Atvatabar the wonder of the ages, a realm of palaces and temples, the fountain of wisdom, the mother of art, and its commerce would make both the earths rich beyond the dreams of fortune. I was determined that the royal magnificence of the thrones of all time on either surface of the earth should be outrivalled by the supreme glory of that of Atvatabar. I knew there was an inspiration to human endeavour that magnificence alone can give, and would use my wealth to advance the happiness of humanity. Lyone being at last fully restored to health, we determined to delay no longer the important ceremonies of our royal marriage and coronation, not only to complete our happiness, but to really establish the government on a personal basis, so agreeable to the wishes and customs of the people. Lyone's aerial yacht was made ready for the journey to Calnogor. It was large enough to carry the captains, officers and men of the Mercury and Aurora Borealis, the captain, officers and men of the Polar King, as well as Lyone and myself and the great officers of state and retinue. All being safely on board, I gave the signal for flight, and in another moment we were launched on the air with tremendous speed. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. Our reception in Calnogor. The royal city of Calnogor never contained such splendour, such importance of historic event, nor such a multitude of people as on the occasion of the triple event of our marriage, our coronation, and the reception of the distinguished strangers from beyond the polar gulf. How shall the glory of that day be described? What occult power must animate the pen that must be at once the stylus of a poet, the brush of a painter, and the wand of a magician to do justice to the splendid theme? The entire army, composed of 500,000 Waleals, had come from Calnogor to Kioram to escort the aerial ship containing myself, Lyone, and the distinguished strangers, together with our retinue and the sailors from America and Great Britain. On either side of the ship, the army was massed in 2 equal hosts, waving 1,000,000 of wings. Either army was led by a phalanx of flying Bokkids, led by Yamul and Grasnagilipas. A bodyguard of Waleals bore 50 gigantic golden sceptres, being the ensigns of sovereignty over the 50 provinces of the kingdom. All the way to Calnogor, 500 miles distant, the army performed the most incredible evolutions to the measured thunders of music. Its legions massed themselves in ever-whirling globes, undulating all along the lines of flight like monstrous serpents. Again, mighty cones of Waleals would stream from our yacht on both sides, upwards and backward, like a blaze of comet splendour. Then, suddenly, globes of Waleals would surround us, globe within globe, flying alternately in different directions, and we seemed to move on the centre of another earth. To describe the endless flight and counterflight, the concentration and radiation of the Waleals in grand review would be impossible. Captain Adams and Sir John Forbes were astounded at the extraordinary evolutions possible to winged men in a world where there is practically no gravity. The army moved in Daedalian march. It was at times sinuous with labyrinthine movement to the sound of drums and the roar of bugles. The whaleals formed arches and crowns, conchoidal convolutions, zones and wheels, hemispheres and globes, cones and pyramids. The yacht was clothed with sublime torsions, peristaltic splendours, and immense radiations of living bodies. It was the grandest movement of men ever seen on earth. We were again completely surrounded by a single globe of whaleals, in the centre of which moved the yacht with fearful speed. The globe moved as fast as we, and the living shell obliterated both earth and sun from sight. Then, with a roar of artillery, the globe exploded, and lo, before us the infinite golden dome of the Bormidophia, the marble city of Calnogor, and the dense multitudes of excited people. The city was decorated with the conquering flag of Lyone and with flowers, and the inscriptions on the triumphal arches were, "Long live Lexington and Lyone, King and Queen of Atvatabar." The entire army, augmented by the allegiance of the defeated king's troops, headed by the Supreme General Hushnoli, received us at the entrance to the city. Pending the reconstruction of the government, law and order were being administered by Hushnoli, assisted by a military council consisting of all the victorious leaders. The festivities incidental to our entry into Calnogor and the public rejoicings over the reincarnation of Lyone lasted several days. I took occasion at the reception at the royal palace to confer suitable honours and rewards on my victorious generals. I created the Supreme General Hushnoli a noble of the first rank under the title of Goylor, or Duke of Calnogor, and confirmed his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the army. And Zuli Soas was also created Goylus of Calnogor. General Garalio was created Boyroon of Swerga, an inland city, and appointed Vice-Commander to Hushnoli. General Rackiron was made Goylur of Swandab, and his appointment as General of the Royal Artillery was confirmed. General Laudemir was made Goylur of Kioram and Commandant of the fortress. General Yamul, who retired from the army, was made Goylur of Naphthasia. The Grand Sorcerer Charka was made Goylur, and the Grand Sorceress Goylus of Egyptlosis, while Grasnagilipas was created Boyroon of Invention and General of the Royal Boccakids. General Starbottle was made Goylur of Savas, a province of the kingdom, and Prime Minister of the government. General Goldrock, who was now fully recovered from his wounded leg, was made Royal Treasurer and Goylur of Blindis, a distant city. Dr. Merryferry was made Minister of Foreign Affairs, General Notothebek, Minister of Naval Affairs, General Pra, Chief of Police, and General Flathootley, Minister of War. I assumed the title of His Majesty Lexington, King of Atvatabar, and Lyone that of Her Majesty Lyone, Queen of Atvatabar, of equal authority and dignity to myself. I issued a decree confirming all titles and dignities for life of the recipient only. As a man cannot transfer his character or abilities to his children, more especially the virtues that made him famous, so neither could he transfer his titles or dignities to posterity, and a man who had no other claim to greatness than the plumes he had borrowed from his father should be despised from strutting in artificial glory. The barodomy was maintained, and no restriction of popular or constitutional liberty already enjoyed by the people was permitted. All titles given to men who were simply fortunate enough to receive a majority of votes, making them representatives of the people in the barodomy, were abolished, and men only were honoured by virtue of great services accomplished. All members of the barodomy were paid liberal salaries, on the principle that a prince had no more right to an appropriation from the public purse than a legislator. All public measures adopted by the barodomy were subject to the veto of the Royal Council, composed of the King, Queen, and actual members of the government. I need not say that the victory of Lyone over death, and the fact that our army having conquered in battle gave us unlimited power. I was the supreme lord of Atvatabar, but nevertheless, in the hour of triumph, I determined to use my power for the good of the people. The sensation caused by the return of Lyone to life had stirred all Atvatabar with feelings of the profoundest awe and loyalty. Vast crowds of people came as pilgrims to see their queen and offer congratulations. Had the old creed, with its worship of Lyone and Harikar, not fallen with the success of our arms, Lyone would undoubtedly have been worshipped anew as a goddess more devoutly than ever. But the revolution being founded on antagonism of the old faith to social welfare and the laws of nature, a new creed must necessarily take its place. The new creed of one body and one soul was based on order, truth, justice, benevolence and temperance. This I styled the Remeloria, or better thing to that which had gone before. The new creed gave the soul mastery of its feelings, and love was measured by a regular throb. Souls becoming stronger and more masculine were the better able to bear the pulsations of joy and despair. They could sustain their emotions with a cordial enthusiasm, and passion, no longer a frantic flame, became a soft and abiding fire. I appointed the Grand Sorcerer Pontiff of Remorialism, giving him authority to formulate a code of ethics that all could adhere to. With such a code as a solid foundation, I hoped in time to establish a purer faith than that possessing only the human soul for its deity. Not many days after our coming to Calnogor, and while still engaged in settling the government of the kingdom, we received a visit from Hushnoli and Zuli Soas. It was with feelings of pain that we heard the object of the Supreme General's visit. With a voice softened with emotion, Hushnoli told his story. In carrying out the reforms at Egyptlosis made necessary by the success of the army of the late goddess, a great difficulty presented itself. It was found that notwithstanding the fact that all the priests and priestesses had fought for Lyone and the new faith, as against the old order of things, nearly 1/2 of the twin souls were still at heart as great devotees of Harakar and hopeless love as ever, while the remaining half had renounced the practices of Egyptlosis in common with their queen. It was found impossible to change the faith of the entire priesthood in a moment, so as to speak, and many still believed that the old faith possessed fruits of self-sacrifice, culture, spirit power, and the ideal life, such as the new state of things would utterly destroy. Hushnoli and the High Priestess were in sympathy with the adherents of the ancient faith, and they too believed in sacrificing marital rights for the sake of the ideal existence. The revelation of such a spiritual revolt in Egyptlosis, headed too by the man and woman who had sacrificed so much for the cause of Lyone and myself, revealed human nature in a new light, while it astounded us. I had foolishly supposed the supremacy of the sword could carry dominion into spiritual things, and that Egyptlosis was wholly converted to the new faith, to Remorialism. The situation was extremely painful. "Supreme General and High Priestess," I said, "both Her Majesty Lyone and myself are greatly indebted to your courage and support in the late struggle, a support heroically given us in spite of your own secret faith. Is there no way by which you might be reconciled, both of you, to the new order of things?" "We fear not, your Majesty," said Hushnoli. "Will riches, will honour not tempt you?" "Your Majesty, we cannot be tempted," replied he. "You are doubtless aware," I continued, "that it would be impossible for the government to recognise, much less give support to, a system of faith for the destruction of which the war was carried on. Much as we love you, much as we love the priests and priestesses, we cannot give allegiance to the old faith. We dare not countenance your creed. It will therefore be impossible for yourselves or your people to remain at Egyptlosis, which will be the chief shrine of the new faith hereafter." "We have already anticipated all this," said Hushnoli, "and do not propose to remain even in Atvatabar." "And where do you go to?" said Lyone in astonishment. "Well, your Majesty," replied he, "we have determined to take possession of the sphere Hilar, one of the untenanted spheres above us, and there create an ideal world. Thus we will relieve your Majesty of all embarrassment and remove any obstacle in the way of religious or political reform." I was bewildered by the reply of Hushnoli, as I had never before heard of anyone desiring to dwell on the wandering sphere Hilar, and begged an explanation. "Hilar, as your Majesty is probably aware," said Hushnoli, "is a sphere 25 miles in diameter that floats in space at a distance of 50 miles from the surface of Atvatabar. It revolves on its own axis at the rate of a mile an hour, making a complete revolution in 75 hours. It also revolves around Swang once during 100 aerial revolutions, or in 100 of its days. It has tropic, temperate and frigid zones, with perpetual ice capping its poles. It contains one ocean of irregular outline and has one continent. The areas of land and water are about equal. There are 2 mountain ranges, turning from a given centre of upheaval and determining the configuration of the land. There are 100 islands in the sea and a dozen rivers on the land. In fact, it seems to be a facsimile in climate, geologic and physiographical conditions to the outer world you have come from. And on such a sphere we propose to build a new throne for Harakar, and seat thereon another goddess like the virtuous and glorious Lyone. Ah, said Lyone, I know who that other goddess will be. She will be the fair civilisations. The high priestess blushed in her robe of crimson silk, making her a golden beauty superb and precious. As for Hushnoli, it was evident the destiny of his counterpart's soul was already fully anticipated. Her ascension to the throne of a goddess would virtually make him ruler of Hilar. We desire, your majesty, said he, to resign our titles and offices of high priest and priestess of Egyptlosis and supreme general and general of the Amazons of the royal army of Atvatabar. Our only request is that we be allowed to depart to Hilar together with such of the priests and priestesses of Harikar as are willing to follow us thither. Also that all new converts to Harikar, desirous of emigrating to our spiritual kingdom, will be secured freedom of departure from Atvatabar for all time hereafter. I willingly granted Hushnoli and civilisations their request, and added, You both shall be promptly and liberally rewarded for the great services rendered your king and queen in time of war, as well as recompensed for past services to the country in Egyptlosis and for loss of estate in Atvatabar. I promise to issue a royal decree embodying all of the aforesaid liberties and bounties in favour of Hushnoli and his fair consort and their followers. The late high priest and high priestess, with grateful cordial adieus, departed from the audience chamber. I thereupon appointed General Rackiron the commander-in-chief of the army in place of Hushnoli, with General Geralio the vice-commander. End of chapter 56. Chapter 57 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The combined ceremony of marriage and coronation. The day of our marriage and coronation as King and Queen of Atvatabar at length arrived. The scene in the Bomidofia was of surpassing magnificence. For the first time in history, Lyone sat before the throne of the gods, not as a goddess but as queen, and I, her compeer, as king, sat beside her. Lyone was attired in a loosely fitting robe of old ivory silk, over which was an outer network of lace formed of thread of gold, the design being a golden sun on the breast, which with its long streaming rays was held together by a golden cobweb that covered the entire figure of the queen. She also wore her belt of jewels. Beside her stood a page bearing her crown as Queen of Atvatabar. For myself, I had caused to be made a knightly suit of golden armour that shone mightily as I wore it on that eventful occasion. The priestesses of Egyptlosis, taught by a priest of decorative art from Gnaphistasia, had been for some time engaged in creating a tapestry of lace wrought with a thread of heavy bullion gold as a bridal gift to their queen. The design took the form of a winged twin soul in loving converse, in the centre surrounded by Atvatbarese arabesque, all held together by a most poetic fancy of floral scrolls, and formed of gold thread lacework. This enormous piece of work was 12 feet in width, 75 feet in length, and 4 inches in thickness. The gold used in its marvellous intricacies weighed 5 tons. Such was the glorious piece of tapestry that was hung over the side of the throne, and which, reaching downward 3/4 of its height, concealed a considerable part of the august structure. Around us swept the amphitheatre, filled with the leaders of the army and navy, the great officers of government and the people of Atvatabar. Surrounding the base of the throne sat those priests and priestesses of Egyptlosis who had embraced the new faith of one body and one soul. The pontiff Charka performed the marriage ceremony when the roar of guns had subsided. He performed his august duties sustained by the splendours of music and the adoration of the people. Wilt thou have this woman Lyone, Queen of Atvatabar, to be thy wife until death, according to the customs of our people, and not according to the customs of Egyptlosis? I will. Wilt thou have this man Lexington, King of Atvatabar, to be thy husband until death, according to the new faith of one body and one soul? I will. The deed was done. Around the throne swept a cyclone of twin souls, resolved on matrimony. In their bewildering flight they became radiant with strange transformations of feeling and gesture, and their songs symbolised the intensity of the great crisis that had arrived in the history of the nation. All around the amphitheatre rose the enormous multitude, as one soul shouting their joy. The guns of the fortress volleyed their thunders. The first act of the great drama ended amid the shouting of armed hosts, the singing of twin souls, and the hosannas of the multitude. The second scene was perhaps still more impressive. The Grand Chamberlain of the Palace, Cleparellium, had put into his phonograph beside us a coil containing the Charter of Coronation. Fitting a megaphone to the phonograph, there issued the following proclamation from the instrument, like a blast of music. Charter of Coronation of their Majesties Lexington and Lyone, King and Queen of Atvatabar. The crown and throne of the realm of Atvatabar, heretofore possessed in the persons of their ex-majesties King Aldmeri Bhoolmakar and Queen Toplissy, being now declared vacant by reason of the desertion, flight, deposition and defeat of said ex-majesties, and said crown and throne of Atvatabar being now possessed by both conquest and by will of the people, in the persons of their majesties Lexington and Lyone, King and Queen of Atvatabar. Now, therefore, we, priests, nobles, statesmen and commanders of army and navy, as representatives of the people, do hereby confirm said possession of the crown and throne of this realm, by placing upon the head of Lexington and upon the head of Lyone their respective crowns as King and Queen of Atvatabar, and do hereby render both King and Queen equal loyalty, fealty and homage as the true and rightful sovereigns of Atvatabar. Signed, Starbottle, Goylor of Calnogor, First Minister of the Government. Charka, Pontiff of Memorialism, Gulor of Egyptlosis. Thubal, Gulois of Egyptlosis. Rakion, Gulor of Swandab, Commander-in-Chief of the Army. Wallace, Admiral of the Fleet. Yermul, Lord of Art, Goylor of Nathastasia. Grasnagalipas, Commander-in-Chief of the Bockakids. Laldemir, Goylor of Kioram. Pra, Minister of Police. Nototherbok, Minister of Naval Affairs. Goldrock, Royal Treasurer. Dr. Merryferry, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Flathootley, Minister of War. Gerolio, Vice Commander of the Army. Coltonbury, Vice Commander of the Bockakids. During the declamation of the megaphone, the Pontiff Charka raised the crown to my head, while his consort Thubal raised the crown of the Queen to Leonie's head. We sat thus crowned amid the tremendous excitement. The guns of the fortress shook the Bormidofia with their explosions. The people shouted, "Life, health and prosperity to our sovereign lord and lady, Lexington and Lyone, King and Queen of Atvatabar." Men heard no sweeter music than the coronation march executed by 1,000 instruments. I realised as I sat with Lyone beneath the throne of the gods a portion of that immeasurable feeling of being universally exalted, universally loved, universally adored. It is true the fervour of idolatry for Lyone had largely subsided, but in its stead came a more perfect loyalty of soul and body on the part of priest and priestess. Souls that had balanced themselves, as it were, on the edge of a sword, once more stood on the solid earth. The magnificence of royalty, which kings born to the purple but rarely feel, was ours. Our sudden good fortune unveiled to us the splendours of power and riches and honour. The people themselves, enchanted with the product of their own abnegation, made their obeisance to us as gods. Lyone grew perceptibly paler with the intensity of her excitement. Her breast rose and fell more rapidly as the soarings of song told her that her supreme realisation of life and fortune as goddess had not wholly died with her apostasy, but that a new life no less glorious had begun. As for myself, seated on the focus of human endeavour, it thrilled me to think what power of realisation I possessed for things I had considered impossible and unattainable. I determined that art should sound the abysses of the inexpressible and bring from thence radiant symbols of all things, clothed with imagination and emotion. Invention would still further extend man's empire over matter. Soul, culture and spirit power would be cultivated in a reformed Egyptlosis. Lyone, mystical and divine, would ever rule Queen of Hearts with the sorcery of her beauty. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The Death of Bhoolmakar. General Flathootley, with his command of 10,000 Fletchermings, who was ordered to pursue and capture the ex-King Bhoolmakar, returned to Calnogor after a month's absence to report the death of King Bhoolmakar and Coshnili, together with several hundred of their followers, and the capture of several thousand Waliels as prisoners. At a special interview with the general, I requested him to report the story of his defeat of the king's troops and the death of the king. "Well, your majesty," said Flathootley, "I must first of all congratulate you on ascending the throne of the enemy. 'Twas the smartest bit of work I've seen since I left the other world." "The troops behaved nobly," I said, "but I'm all anxious to hear how you captured the king." "Well then, your majesty, I come up to the place called Gapathis, about 1,500 miles from here, away beyond on the Wales Sea shore." "Had he a large force with him?" I asked. "Bedad and he had. He had a bodyguard of about 5,000 waylails, but sure, we made short work of the flying soldiers." "Well, tell me exactly what happened," I said. "Troth and I will, your majesty. Sure, our flying sailors are darling fellows. We skirmished up the enemy until we got in between us and the say, and then we fell to. The bloody rascals tried to spear us and did kill about a dozen or two of our boys. But we touched them up lively with our pitchforks, and begorra they didn't like that at all. A wee red-faced captain called out that they were going to fight for their king to the last. 'How long are you going to last yourself, sonny?' says I. Afore the words were out of my mouth, somebody laid the wee fellow out, as night as a funeral. Well, we fell upon them from front and rear, as the saying is, and bejebbers, I killed the man with the first blow." "Walk right into them," I shouted, and there we were, fighting and slashing and killing one another, as if it were a matter of business. If the king's soldiers flew up, why we flew up too, and chased them down again. It was like a pandemonium of fighting cocks. There was a big fellow who made a slash at me with his sword, but I lifted him on my fork and very nicely showed me the whites of his eyes. The best part of the performance was old Booley, who had himself in the middle of his bodyguard and waving a toy sword asked his friends to kill us. Well, to make a long story short, the enemy being very badly beaten, threw up their arms, and we captured the entire lot, except for about 500 waylails who flew away as fast as their heels could carry them. "How did the king conduct himself when captured?" I inquired. "He came up to me and, bowing very nicely, offered me his sword. He said he was glad to surrender to a brave general and hoped I would give him the honours of war." "Bejabbers, I will that," said I, "but that'll be after we throw ye by court-martial. But where's Mrs. Booley?" says I. "Does your excellency mean her late majesty?" said Booley. "If so, I regret to say the unhappy fate which has overtaken both myself and her country prostrated her so much that she died." "Well then," says I, "where's that other conspirator, Cashneely?" "I am here, your excellency," says he, stepping forward and handing me his sword, "and I also surrender." "You do well," says I, "to give up your sword, for it saves me the trouble of taking it from you." "And now, me rascals," I said, "we're going to save the trouble of looking after you by throwing you through court-martial. Let the court be formed," says I, "and bring forth the prisoners." The king's soldiers were disarmed and their wings taken off, and were assembled in a circle under guard. Booley and Cashneely, under a special guard, stood in the middle of the ring. "Now, boys," says I, "play fair and no favour. Who's got a charge again the prisoners?" With that, one of my men stepped forward and said that Booley and Cashneely had organised resistance to a change of government and religion, thereby blocking the wheels of reform, and furthermore had conspired to murder, and bejabbers did murder, Her Holiness the Goddess, of blessed memory, who, although alive again, was undoubtedly killed. When Booley and Cashneely heard that the goddess was alive again, their knees knocked together with fear. "This is a terrible charge again, you both," said I. "I don't know which offence is the greatest, killing a decent goddess or blocking the wheels of reform. Anyhow, the one crime is as bad as the other. Who supports the charge?" I added in thundering tones. Well, Ivory Soldier on the spot volunteered to give evidence as to blocking the wheels of reform, but nobody saw the murder committed. "Now," says I, addressing the prisoners, "did yez murder the goddess or did yez not? By your souls, tell the truth, guilty or not guilty?" "Guilty," said both prisoners. "Then by your own mouths ye be condemned," said I. "The sentence of this court is that you both be beheaded on the mortal spot." "I think, Flathootly," said I, "that you rather exceeded your duty in so hastily condemning the prisoners. You should have brought them to Calnogor for proper trial and execution." "Sure, I knew that, but to tell your majesty the truth, it wouldn't have added to your credit to have ordered the execution of Booley, and so I took the responsibility of the whole thing on myself. I made Booley and Cashneely kneel down, and a soldier tied their hands behind their backs. Then I ordered a waylail to behead them with their own swords. After some hot work, the heads of both murderers rolled on the ground." "Why didn't you shoot them or kill them at once with your spears?" "I considered that as too easy a death for them. I didn't want them to die without knowing they were getting hurt." I forgave Flathootly for his too hasty execution of the ex-king, as he had undoubtedly saved me a very disagreeable duty, and the hasty taking off of his ex-majesty prevented any demonstration in his favour. To assure the people of my anxiety for a popular government, I issued a proclamation ordering a general election to create a new barodomy in place of the assembly whose members had disappeared or were made prisoners of war or were dead. In thus providing for a constitutional government, I granted the nation not only all its ancient privileges, but added new and more important measures of political liberty. As the revenues of Atvatabar amounted to $8 billion per annum, there was no danger of myself or comrades of the Polar King falling short of handsome revenues. The re-establishment of the government, the reorganisation of the army, navy and police, together with the care of the palaces of Calnogor and Tangier, and the new ritual for the Bhoolmakar and Egyptlosis occupied my attention for a longer period than I at first contemplated. While these things were being accomplished, I gave a grand public reception and royal banquet to Captain Adams and Sir John Forbes and the officers and seamen of the ships Mercury and Aurora Borealis in acknowledgment of their great services to our cause. At the same time, I did not forget to give our friends a more solid proof of my gratitude in the shape of a large bounty in gold. End of chapter 58. Chapter 59 of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nigel Fisher. The history concluded. I think it is right that I should conclude the history of the conquest of Atvatabar with my being crowned king of the realm. I at once assumed my functions as ruler of Atvatabar. I was supreme commander of the army and grand admiral of the fleet. In council with the ministers of the government appointed by the Barodomy, I caused the adoption of many beneficent laws, calculated to make my people prosperous and happy. Hushnoli soon departed, with his retinue of twin souls, to found a new Egyptlosis on the sphere of Hilar, with Zulisoas as a goddess. It was with great grief that I parted with these beloved friends. Hushnoli and his flock were not to be persuaded that nature herself was hostile to their esoteric practices, so to avoid antagonism it was best that we should part. I promised Hushnoli that together with Lyone I would visit his globe sometime in the future, and see how his colony progressed. He was an enthusiast who required a great many defeats from fortune before he could see the fatal defects of his social and religious system. The grand sorcerer, as the pontiff of memorialism, or the ethics of nature, achieved a triumph in restoring Egyptlosis to the reign of order, truth, justice, benevolence and temperance. In time I hope to see the Christian faith rule the souls of those who had so recently worshipped themselves under the guise of Harikar, the universal human soul. I was anxious to see men and women possessing that serene poise of passion that alone can sustain virile action. Lyone herself was the first to be convinced that the human soul, with its limitations, its narrowness, its impatience, its selfishness, its arrogance, its cruelty, was a very inferior deity. It was true that rare ideal joys might be purchased for a brief time under the old regime, but they were only purchased at an immense price, out of all proportion to the value received, and their possession produced a sickly sublimity, totally unfitting the soul for the practical duties of life. Captain Adams and Sir John Forbes, excited at my good fortune, declared themselves anxious, with my consent, to explore the further hemisphere of the interior planet, in the interests of science, discovery, commerce, and possibly conquest. They were anxious to discover the continents that lie above and beyond Atvatabar, surrounded by unknown Plutosian seas, and to bear their respective countries some signal trophies of their daring and prowess in the internal world. It was arranged that on their return to Kioram, the Polar King, with myself and Lyone on board, should sail with the Mercury and Aurora Borealis for the United States. The sailing of the three vessels up New York Bay would be a historic event, and great would be the curiosity of the American people to see the goddess of Atvatabar and our retinue of whale eels as proof of the existence of Bimbisarol, the interior world. And now, my dear reader, we must part for the present. By a change of plans on the part of Captain Adams, the Mercury, the vessel that will bear the manuscript of my adventures in the interior world, is already waiting to start on her voyage. I regret that many strange things have been left unsaid, many extraordinary experiences have been omitted, because I am desirous that this brief history of the happiness that befell me and my devoted sailors in Atvatabar should be published without delay, to allay the natural curiosity excited on the outer world by the story of our discovery of Plutasia. You may possibly feel a desire to know the future fortunes of Queen Lyone and myself in a part of the world hitherto undreamed of, and when I again address you, I hope to describe our future experiences on the throne of Atvatabar. We purpose to apply a liberal portion of the vast wealth of our kingdom to the pursuit of invention, art and spirituality, preserving and enlarging the existing palaces of invention and art, and the palaces of Egyptlosis as institutions for the development of the soul and its attributes of spirit power. It will be our purpose to extend to the utmost limits the empire of mind over matter in developing invention. In art we will, by means of its manifold radiant symbols, reproduce every idea of the soul shaped by sentiment and imagination, and in sounding the abysses of the heart express what is considered the inexpressible. In spirituality, the science and art of soul and its manifestations in the body, and the temporary or complete severance therefrom, will be investigated on a much wider basis than ever before, and spirit power, apart from the worship of soul as deity, will be developed and elaborated into an enduring force possessing creative energy. What boundless empire of life will not such ideas realise, and how entrancing the story of such discoveries in the interior world of the soul. I may also, dear reader, request you to accompany me to other undiscovered realms of Plutesia, where, according to report, exist fairylands, peopled with strange fantastic races of men and women, as well as fabulous animals with characteristics surpassing the wildest dreams of fantasy. As shown on the map of the interior world, which forms the frontispiece of this volume, many more continents remain yet unknown to me, to explore, which will be my ambition. If the rumours I have heard of semi-spiritual men and semi-human monsters that dwell in tropical environments, where mountains rise so high there is no weight on their summits, and where torrents of water roll upward, sweeping away villages in their path, of rocks of gold suspended in the air, of tribes dwelling on floating islands of jewels in the Empyrean, and of 1,000 still stranger places and peoples, where every fantasy of the imagination can be produced in reality by spirit power, then indeed the story of my adventures will develop the soul of the age with a profound delight. I therefore bid adieu to you, dear reader, in the hope of meeting you again, to feast you with these wonders. I hope to have you accompany me on the Polar King, which, after a season of repair and refitment, will most assuredly be launched for a still more adventurous voyage on the waters of the interior sea. How many books have been written on the discovery of the Western Hemisphere by Columbus, while as yet but one has been written about the interior sphere, a region not less important than the outer earth, whose geographical features are now for the first time revealed to human eyes. What a wonder it would be if one could travel to the moon or the planet Mars, and return to the earth to tell of all that he had seen or heard on those distant spheres. Here indeed is no less a miracle that for ages 2 vast planets have existed unknown to each other, although only 1,000 miles apart, with the means of communication possessing but few difficulties to be overcome. The mutual discovery of 2 such worlds has opened up a future for the human race that may well strike one dumb with its splendour. It has conferred on the meanest individual a glory, a birthright of the spirit, as vast as the properties of the twin planet. I will not further anticipate the future, and for the present will ask you to accept from Leone and myself a courteous farewell. The End. End of chapter 59. End of The Goddess of Atvatabar by William Richard Bradshaw.